Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us to discuss new research we are publishing today on how we can finance the pipeline of over 12,000 community-led homes. I work for the Community Land Trust Network. We bring together CLTs across England with plans to build more than 7,000 of those homes, having built over 1,000 in recent years. And together with our partners in community-led homes, we're working to ensure that more than 600 community-led projects can be delivered in coming years. And the financing question which we're discussing today is obviously a key part of that. We'll start this morning with government and politics. We will hear from the Housing Minister and his views on the topic, and then from Danny Kruger MP, who's been very supportive of community-led housing. Unfortunately, Richard Bacon MP sends his apologies, but you may have read his recent review of Self and Custom Build, which includes an extensive section on community-led housing and recommended consistent revenue funding for the sector. So after hearing from Christopher and Danny, we'll have a presentation from the two researchers who produced this research, Tom Archer and Catherine Harrington, and they'll be able to present their main findings. Then we're going to hear some reactions from key stakeholders in Homes England, the Greater London Authority, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, the social investor Kath Venturesome, and the lender Ecology Building Society, which is also a partner of ours. We'll hear what role they can play in financing this pipeline and perhaps their views on what difference government could make in unlocking that money. As time allows, we'll then be open for questions and comments and be finishing at 11 o'clock. We are recording today, and please put any questions or comments in the Q&A where you should find a button at the bottom, and we'll try to reach them at the end. There is also a button at the bottom of your screen to turn on and off the live transcript, if that's helpful. Sometimes it's a bit like watching the news with a rolling transcript and it's get things a bit wrong. So it can be irritating. Take it off if you don't want it, but hopefully it's helpful for those who would like it. I'd like finally just to thank the Nationwide Foundation and Power to Change for co-funding this work, and our partners in community-led homes for helping to shape it. We will be making a joint submission to the spending review on the basis of this research seeking expansion of the Community Housing Fund. So without any further introduction, I'd like to hand over to the Housing Minister, Christopher.
Well, thanks very much, Tom, for that introduction, and thanks also for inviting me to the launch of the Community-Led Housing Pipeline report. It's a real pleasure to join you, albeit I'm sad to say briefly today. I should say at the outset that the department has really an excellent working relationship with Dr. Archer, Tom Archer, and also with Catherine in her previous role at the National CLT Network. So I'm really pleased that that relationship is continuing. And I'd like also to thank, although of course he's not with us today, but I'm sure out there somewhere in the ether he is with us in spirit. I'd like to thank Richard Bacon, who's helped get this event off the ground. It would be so much better had we been able to have it in person at Westminster, which is an even more than exciting place at the moment than it usually is. But albeit we're meeting virtually, it's very good that we've had this event. And Richard's report to the Prime Minister of July, which we're working closely upon, has given us all something to think about. I think that community-led housing has an important, indeed you might say, unique contribution to make to meeting our housing need, because it brings forward land which is oftentimes out of reach of mainstream developers, and it delivers housing that is otherwise unavailable or can't be reached without really close involvement with local people. It also, hugely importantly, helps build community cohesion, because you've got a sense of common purpose, you've got self-determination in there, it sustains local communities, local economies, it delivers really good examples of great quality, sometimes award-winning design, modern methods of construction, environmental performance, construction quality, the list goes on. And that is why I think, in short, community-led housing projects align very closely with many of MHCLG's ambitions, and that's why we're pleased to support the work that the sector has been doing in recent years. And if you look if you look around the world, countries in Europe and North America, you can see very clearly the potential that community-led housing as a sector has to grow. It can be potentially enormous, and that's why we were very pleased to launch in 2021, 2022, the CHF fund. We launched it last month. I'm grateful to Tom Chance and his colleagues with the Community-Led Homes Partnership for the tremendous amount of work that they have put in to help launch the fund. The early signs, I think, are really very encouraging indeed. The initial response has been really very strong. And I know that Tom and your colleagues, you've been really effective in promoting the CHF and helping drive those schemes forward, with, of course, Richard Bacon laying the whip across my back occasionally in the chamber of the House of Commons to remind me how important the fund is. In terms of homes built, tangible outcomes from our point of view are crucial. So we're looking forward to seeing the fund deliver results. And that's why we focus this year's funding on those projects which are most advanced. So briefly onto the report that is being launched today. I think it's an authoritative and useful piece of work. It makes very clear that there's a great deal of potential out there. And research like this is very useful, not only in helping us to understand the potential scale of the sector, but also in reflecting on what government, what lenders, what other players in the sector can achieve collectively by bringing the pipeline forward. It also helps us, by the way, in our discussions with the Treasury, because you will have all heard me say before, I'm sure, that though not all good ideas start in the Treasury, all good ideas can end in the Treasury if the Treasury doesn't like them. So it's important we can come together and present a cohesive, appealing, coherent package which the Treasury can get behind. And I welcome particularly, therefore, I'm sure they will as well, the recognition that government support has been and ought to be a catalyst to helping lever more funding into the sector from a range of sources. So I want to congratulate you all on the work that you are doing. Once again, I think the Community Housing Fund reaches parts of the country which otherwise have been out of reach. It reaches areas that we really do need to get into, and it ensures that new homes can come forward. So I want to thank you again for inviting me to join you today. I wish you more power to your individual and collective elbows. If I could stay around for a little longer, I would, but unfortunately I've got to go off and prepare for a bill committee, the line-by-line scrutiny of the building safety bill, which kicks off later this morning. So I hope you won't mind if I excuse myself now by once again finally thanking you for all you're doing and wishing you all the best for the future. Good luck today. Good luck with the report. Good luck building community-led housing. Thanks.
Minister, thank you very much. And we of course understand that bill is very important as well. So we wish you luck this morning.
For me. Thanks very much, Tom. Take care.
Thank you. So I'd like to hand over to Danny.
Thanks, Tom. Assume you can hear me. I'm MP for Devizes and had an interest in this area for some time since I've only been an MP for less than 2 years, but before that was very inspired by what I knew of community-led housing as a model for supporting particularly inner city areas, which is where I was working before. Now I represent a rural constituency and have discovered the immense potential of this model there as well. And there are some great people in Wiltshire, where I'm the MP, part of the pipeline that's been identified in the research today. So, I was very good to hear Chris Pincher there. He's an enthusiast for this agenda. I mean, as he didn't say too explicitly, he's up against and ministers are generally up against a system in government which isn't by any means opposed, but is institutionally antipathetic to the sorts of projects that we are talking about because of their small scale and because of the way the Treasury, as Chris mentioned, does its calculations, and the bang for buck consideration, the value for money. Maths doesn't always work out for community-led housing in the way that obviously we all know that there is enormous value, economic as well as all the social advantages of it. So I am pleased that we have in him an ally. Obviously, the Secretary of State has just changed, and which is a shame for us because Tom and I and a bunch of CLT leaders from around the country had a meeting with Robert Jenrick on Monday, and which seemed to go very well. And he was extremely encouraging and responded very well to some of the suggestions that we made and invited further engagement. But that's okay. Michael Gove is now there. I'm a very big admirer of him and his reforming zeal and abilities and his desire to, he will be going at the country's housing challenge with vigor, and I know he also is a fan of the community-led initiative. If you think of what he did in education, he basically supported from the centre, insurgent community-led initiatives to challenge the incumbent provision of schools and school places. And what are we trying to do here with community-led housing? That, and it's, so if you think of CLTs as the free schools of the housing system, then I think we might have an ally in Michael. So that's my hope, and I will be lobbying, as will many others, to him. And in fact, Tom and I wrote yesterday to him with the colleagues that we met with Jenrick with the other day, to introduce the work and to make some suggestions for how to expedite CLTs and to get more support for them through the system. And Tom, if you're happy for me to do this, shall I just quickly run through the suggestions we've made, and it might be worth colleagues on the call understanding what it is that we've been lobbying for. Are you happy for me to do that, or did you want to do that?
Yes, that's fine. That's fine, Danny.
Private. Okay, good. We did emphasise that the extent of CLTs that have been developed in recent years are a real success for the government. I mean, it's because of Community Housing Fund that many of these projects have been able to happen at all. What we need is for that to be more long term, and the great challenge, of course, with government financing is the short term funding cycles. But that doesn't seem to stop them on other big infrastructure projects. Treasury manages to provide long term funding, including in the housing space. So we think that they should make the Community Housing Fund aligned with for instance, the Affordable Homes Programme, which it should be aligned with anyway, to support give projects the opportunities to bed in, to develop the local support and do their planning and preparation for because these things take time. We encourage, this Tom's initiative, encouraging them to think about a community permission in principle, which is like the way that rural exception sites work at the moment, where there's demonstrable community engagement. It should be possible anywhere to give community-led projects permission in principle to rather like they're proposing in growth areas in the planning white paper. So and this has been tried, Tom tells us, in Cambridgeshire, which is encouraging, and in East Cambridgeshire. So we suggest that could be a national policy. And then more generally, how to join up all the different housing initiatives that could potentially come together to make CLTs easier. All these various rights that haven't been as effective as they might be, the right to transfer, community right to bid, and so on. But there's all these different programs and funds: Community Housing Fund, Affordable Homes Programme, Community Ownership Fund, the Levelling Up Fund. We're about to have soon, we hope, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which is massive, all of which could potentially be supporting the sort of small-scale community-led initiatives that we want to see. And we urged the Minister to consider how to mainstream CLTs in social housing delivery. particularly, I think about potential for transferring ownership of housing estates from local authorities to community ownership. So there's a bunch of quite large and small, but pretty transformative suggestions that I hope Michael Gove will be taking on. We'll encourage Chris Pincher as well. And I suppose my simple thought to end with is, the report is tremendous because it puts in very plain terms what is currently possible, what exists in the pipeline, if you took a snapshot of the demand for, the potential supply of CLT homes is, and it's impressive that there is that pipeline, and it's really good to have had that demonstrated in this very robust and authoritative and sort of academic way. Of course, what it doesn't do and can't do, and this in a sense is our job and job of politicians, is to try and demonstrate that there's a dynamic aspect to this, and the more we talk about the CLT model, the more government overtly endorses and champions it, the more it becomes part of the conversation about how we tackle our housing crisis. The potential demand is absolutely, or supply, whichever way you put it, is potentially enormous, and I think we are seeing the beginnings of what I hope will be an incredibly exciting and powerful movement that could slowly sweep through our country, and this could become the default model for social housing and for affordable housing in our country. So I really do congratulate the network and Catherine and Tom for the work, because it gives the Treasury something to get its teeth into, but it's only the beginning. And I will continue to champion the potential of this sector and this model, because I think there is so much more that can be done. We just need to get this absolutely lodged into the consciousness of the public and of politicians, that this isn't just a little sort of peripheral activity that happens in a few, well-organized villages. This could be the standard for how we do house building. Back to you.
Well, thanks, Tony. That's great. That's sort of both the political moment we're in right now, and also a vision as to where we could be going with this. So I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Tom Archer and Catherine Harrington to talk about their research. Just like to remind everybody that you can put questions and comments in the Q&A. So when we get to the after Tom and Catherine and after the response, sort of key stakeholder responses, we will get to those. So do put those questions and comments in. I'm hoping that Danny will be sticking around, and Tom and Catherine certainly will be. So it could be a political question, could be a question about the research itself, or a question about the responses that we'll hear following Tom and Catherine. So Tom and Catherine, over to you both.
Thanks, Tom, and good morning, everybody. And thanks for those previous contributions. I think they're really helpful in setting out some of the opportunities and context for the development of community-led housing. And I really like that final point about the kind of virtuous circle that can be created by more projects coming through, more political support, which ultimately will lead to more delivery. So I think that's a valuable point. Catherine and I, for the last few months, have really been working on the practicalities of how you ensure that as many homes get built as possible, and to look at what that pipeline looks like. So we have a brief slot now to talk you through some of the findings of the research. So I'm just going to share my screen with you for some slides. Hopefully you can see that. So since the spring, Catherine and I have been looking at a few things really. First, just to get a sense of the state of the community-led housing pipeline. So what are the projects that are being developed? And what are the homes that are being planned within those projects? And then to really try to estimate what their funding and finance requirements are. On the basis of that, we've also looked at some of the gaps, looked at the funding and finance system as a whole, and tried to explore where the gaps in that are. This is obviously quite a changing context. There's funders stepping in and out of the sector, so it's been an important piece of work, I think, and ultimately to make recommendations to the sector about what can be done to maximise delivery. So I'm going to talk through some of those former issues around the pipeline, and then hand over to Catherine, who will talk through some of the gaps, the nature of those gaps, and some of our recommendations. So we've used a kind of new and quite detailed set of data to estimate the kind of projects and the homes being planned in England. So we estimate there's around 650 active projects, and they're planning nearly 12,000 homes across England. Now, it's really important to say two things about that. The first is that there may be projects at an earlier stage, some that are mothballed, some that are on the kind of periphery of the sector, if you like, that may be developing. So we see this as kind of a conservative estimate that's based on the kind of best data that we have. So it's just a word of caution that there may be other projects out there, and it may be bigger than we think. The second point, it is really to say that that it's important that this kind of continued assessment of delivery is continued, because that's how the case is really made. We really need to understand how many homes are being completed and what that looks like over time. So as we look across these projects, what we really see, and it's important to set it in a historical context really, is some continued momentum. So the sector's been through, and the housing development sector generally has been through a really difficult time. But what we see is this momentum has been maintained for probably 3 or 4 years since we first really started doing these calculations on the pipeline. So it's important to say that there's momentum there, and there is a danger that kind of prevailing winds could really kind of knock the momentum out of the sector if we don't really find some of the solutions to these funding and finance issues. So in terms of the homes being planned, most of them are over 80% are actually planning tenures that could bid into the affordable homes programme. So affordable rent products, social rent products, and shared ownership. But there is then 20%, and in that 20% is affordable tenures that wouldn't be eligible for that funding. So it creates a bit of a question around how do we make sure those homes also get built, even though they may not be eligible for capital grants as it stands. So looking at the pipeline, we've used that data from the pipeline and also information about previous rounds of the Community Housing Fund to really try to estimate what their revenue funding needs are. And if you took the pipeline in its totality and what we think it needs and try to estimate what we think it needs, that would be up to 45 million, and that's a kind of point in time estimate. If you just looked at those projects that are at the more advanced stage, it looks more like revenue requirements in the region of 19 million. So clearly, if we think about the Community Housing Fund for this year, there is a lot of surplus demand out there for funding. It's just whether it's eligible and it can be accessed in time. That's some of the key questions we raised before. Now, what that doesn't do is really factor in new projects that are getting started and what their funding requirements are. So we try to look at this over a broader time span and kind of hypothesize that if a new community housing fund was set up that run until 2026, what demand for that would be like for revenue funding. And we estimate in the region between 39 and 60 million. And the lower end of that range accounts for quite a lot of attrition. So a lot of projects that don't make it at that point. Now, we also looked at what we think are the kind of capital requirements for these projects. And we think if all of those homes were to be built, it would generate development costs in the region of about £2.5 billion. Now, obviously, that's unlikely to happen. If we look at those projects at the most advanced stage, those that are seeking planning permission, that are securing sites, their costs are in the region of around 300 million, we think. So it's substantial. Now, not all of that would be met by grant. Obviously, that's the full development cost. There's some lending in there, but it obviously gives a sense of what some of the capital requirements might be in the future. So as I mentioned at the start, we, alongside looking at the pipeline, we also assessed the financial landscape as a whole. And we have a big spreadsheet that we won't share now. It wouldn't fit on my screen, I don't think. But this kind of captures that map of the landscape. So across the top is the kind of development phases of projects, and down the left-hand side is the different forms of finance available. And we've adapted this from some good work by Collaborative Housing last year. And this is really how we get to pinpoint where we think the gaps are in the funding landscape as it stands. And we see revenue funding issues for grant revenue funding issues at the kind of group site plan phase. some specific site issues around how you access finance to acquire sites, and then also some issues around the build finance. And I'm going to hand over to Catherine now, who's going to talk a little bit more about that, and also some of the recommendations in the report.
Thanks, Tom. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, can you hear me, Tom? Because I can only see you. Great. Can you go on to the next slide? Please, thanks. Okay, so how can existing funders and lenders meet those requirements then? So with regards to the significant gap in revenue funding for the group and plan stage, what we found is that there's little prospect of any new dedicated fund being established for community-led housing in the near future. The two major sources, obviously the Community Housing Fund and Power to Change's Homes in Communities' Hands programme, have either substantially been reduced in the case of the Community Housing Fund or have closed altogether. And whilst there will be opportunities for groups to apply to programmes that will be launched under Power to Change's new strategy, we concluded that it's unlikely that that will substantively meet the funding requirement, revenue funding requirement of the sector. Now, this reduction in funding is having a knock-on effect on subsequent funds. So CAF Venturesom's Community-Led Housing Fund has already experienced a drop in pipeline since the Community Housing Fund closed. It might sound a bit counterintuitive, but actually their pipeline was really boosted when the Community Housing Fund was open, partly because it gave groups, the Community Housing Fund gave groups confidence to then apply to loan funding. And also they could use the loan funding to maybe cover costs that weren't covered by the CHF, or to cover the costs of certain items until the arrears payments of the CHF came through. So as CAF Venturesome told us, being the sole funder in the market is a problem. If there is no other funding available, it will compromise the sustainability of our community-led housing fund, as there will be limited pipeline and no one to act as a relay of our fund. Now, attracting new funders, new grant funders, is also going to be a challenge. Many of them redirected their funding during the pandemic to support frontline organisations. And those that are interested in supporting housing tend to kind of be most interested in supporting organisations that work in the area of acute need, and they don't necessarily see community-led housing as meeting acute need. So there's maybe some work to be done there on kind of demystifying the need that is being met by community-led housing. But I don't want to be all doom and gloom. There could be an opportunity here. An opportunity might lie in actually making the case for how community-led housing relates to or contributes to broader areas of interest to funders, and for example, climate change and energy efficiency, placemaking, diversity and inclusion, and where they might be putting in place cross-cutting programs rather than wanting to just support individual sectors. So the sector could be, for example, forming alliances with other organisations to make the case for a cross-cutting programme on, say, site acquisition that then would benefit the community-led housing sector. Similarly, even if funders aren't able to support the sector individually in a significant way, they might be willing to do so collectively. And where they might have more of a focus on, say, certain geographical areas or meeting certain needs, it could be a time for the sector to be pitching for more targeted funding. So, for example, a programme to support community-led housing in the 20% most deprived communities. So there are some opportunities. We also concluded that philanthropic investment and loan funding, whilst obviously a very attractive proposition for this stage, is highly unlikely and, well, not a viable option actually for this stage of funding. Philanthropic investment of the type that's used in CAF Venturesome's fund requires investors to be prepared to make a 10 to 15% loss on their investment. And with regards to loan funding, the risk levels at this stage are so high that interest rates would not only be unattractive, but would threaten the viability of projects. However, as we point out in the report, to reduce the risk, there could be much more of a focus on supporting replicable delivery routes. So groups that partner with registered providers, or encouraging groups to develop multiple schemes. A lot of risk would remain, but it would be substantially reduced, and that's reflected in our recommendations. With regards to the site stage, here, as Tom said, that there is a gap here. Obviously, CAF Venturesome have a very helpful site purchase fund, but there is a limit of 400,000 So it's not suitable for larger schemes. And it's also not really suitable for groups that want to respond quickly to an opportunity in the market. So there may be merit to look again at the lab proposal or other models that acquire sites for groups until the groups are then in a position to buy them themselves. With regards to the build phase, the sector is yet to be embraced by the mainstream. And amongst the handful of very crucial lenders who do lend to the sector, there actually appears to be a real appetite to lend more, but there are barriers to that, including the speed at which schemes are coming through, the quality of financial planning, and issues with relationship management. One solution to that could be, though, for groups and hubs to develop multiple schemes, thereby building up their equity and capabilities and skills. And also maybe for hubs to consider becoming a bit of a broker between individual groups that they're supporting and the lender or the lenders. So packaging up applications to then take to the lender. Obviously, they would need to have a thorough knowledge of what the lender is looking for, but obviously that's within the realms of possibility. Lastly, there's a real need to improve take-up, access to and take-up to the Affordable Homes Programme and really drive bids to the Affordable Homes Programme. Perhaps taking advantage of the new approach to strategic partnerships, because over 50% of delivery of the Affordable Homes Programme will be through those strategic partners. Only one of those included community-led housing in their bid, but that's not to say that others couldn't be encouraged to work with community-led housing groups to actually now deliver their allocation. And similarly, I know that there's a requirement of for those strategic partners to deliver 25% of their allocation through modern methods of construction. Could the same case be made for community-led housing, that 10% of them need to work with community-led housing groups, for example? But I think we concluded to make the case for that. There needs to be better links with different parts of the agency, and also more capacity within the agency itself to champion community-led housing. And clearly Richard Bacon's recommendation for their custom and self-build delivery unit within Homes England would be very helpful to achieving that. So next slide, please. Thanks. So what about new funding streams? So when Tom and I were scoping out the research in this section, we looked at whether there might be some opportunities with some of the new funds that are coming along, like the Shared Prosperity Fund, Levelling Up Fund, Community Ownership Fund. But there was not much known about most of those funds at the time, and also not many of them are focused on housing. So what we thought was an area worthy of investigation was actually to look at the role of combined authorities, as some of them were supporting community-led housing, and in some cases very significant ways. We cover it in full in the report, and I'm conscious of time, but the two main findings were that actually where combined authorities have secured devolved funding for housing, so in addition to their general fund that they got through the devolution deal, they might have got an additional pot for housing. They've been able to put in place much more flexible funding, more tailored to the needs of the sector, than is achievable at the moment through national programmes like the Affordable Homes Programme. So Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority have a 100 billion housing fund through which they provide capital grants to housing associations and groups, as well as development finance. And they don't require community-led housing groups to become registered providers to then be the landlord of those homes. So overcoming one of the barriers that many of the groups find with regards to the Affordable Homes Programme. And also they can provide development finance on much more flexible terms and kind of considering projects on a case-by-case basis. We also found that some hubs are supported, some combined authorities are supporting hubs in different ways. So Greater Manchester Combined Authority have used the surplus generated from their 300 million housing investment fund to provide a revenue grant to the hub that they were actually involved in initiating in the first place. And similarly, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough have an in-house community-led housing enabler team, and they also provide startup grants. However, we kind of do want to point out that whilst there are clearly some opportunities to work with combined authorities, and we'd really encourage hubs that have the resource to do that to try and unlock the pipeline in their area, combined authorities obviously have a number of competing priorities, limited resources, and as you can see from this map, only covered part of the country. So it's by no means a catch-all solution. So next slide, please. Thanks. In light of all these findings, we make a number of recommendations to different audiences in the report, and I really encourage people to have a look at those. I think it's from page 36, maybe, onwards. But just to highlight the main ones, to government, and as we've already heard today, we very much recommend that there is a long-term revenue funding for the sector, both to provide certainty to the sector, but also to allow funders and lenders to put in place funds and programmes that can complement the government's role. To funders, we recommend that there's collective action to address the gap. Sorry, something's just popped up, so I can't actually see the slides. To address the collective action to address some of the gaps, including in pre-development funding and site acquisition in particular. And to the community-led housing sector, we recommend that there's more done to influence certain audiences, particularly funders, making the case for how community-led housing can contribute to their broader areas of concern, like climate change and etc., and also combined authorities, and that there's a much sharper focus on supporting replicable delivery routes for those partnering with registered providers or supporting groups to develop multiple projects, not only to drive delivery, but actually to develop a much more mature funding and finance system, which is what the sector now really needs. So that was a quick canter through, and I hope you have time to have a look at the report in full, and we look forward to hearing what you think. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Tom and Catherine. So we'll be, if you've all received a copy of the research, and we'll be publishing it on our website, because there's an awful lot in there to get your teeth into, and we'll be thinking about further work we can do in the coming months to pick up these different recommendations. We'd like now to hear some reactions from some of the key stakeholders that are mentioned in the research. I'm going to bring them one by one, and if you could, given the time, keep your remarks limited to about 3 minutes each. And remind again, just please put anyone else put questions into the Q&A. So we're going to start with Matthew Dodd, who is the Senior Affordable Housing Strategy Manager in Homes England. Matt, over to you.
Hello, sorry for the slight delay there. Thanks very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to come along to this session today. It's already been really interesting, and the report is incredibly interesting too, and we welcome that report. Quick intro, I'm Senior Affordable Housing Strategy Manager at Homes England. I've had a bit of a specialism on rural housing, but also very much on community-led housing for a number of years now. And so I was really happy to be invited along today. A quick bit about Homes England, our role in delivering the government's housing priorities across England, and we do this through our investment programmes, some of which have been mentioned today around grant programmes. We do it through loan investment. We bring sites forward to get them ready for the market and to dispose of them into the market to increase housing capacity, and we also try and build capacity and enable local authorities and other partners to deliver more housing too. As part of that, we've worked on community housing initiatives for a few years, right back to the Community-Led Project Support Fund, if people remember that, in 2013, and then having some dedicated funding within our affordable homes programs for community-led development, right up to the Community Housing Fund. The most recent Community Housing Fund, where we delivered revenue funding for groups, revenue funding for local authorities, and capital funding for infrastructure projects and for delivering those community-led homes. Homes England has a strategic objective around diversifying the housing market, and we see community-led development as a key part of that. So it fits in to the work that we do really well. The Housing Minister mentioned it earlier, but I think it's worth reiterating. You know, community-led development can really deliver homes in areas that are otherwise not touched by development, and so it can form a really important part of solving some of the housing issues that we have within this country. So, in order to do that, we need to get community groups and organisation accessing our funds better, and I think that comes across really well in the report. And so what was mentioned in the report around the Affordable Homes Programme, that's key. There's a huge amount of that delivery could be taken forward under the affordable rent product, social rent product, or shared ownership products, or all delivered through the Affordable Homes Programme. So that's important to get access to that. And there are two strands to that. There is the strategic partnerships that were mentioned earlier, and we'll certainly be working in partnership with those large associations that have secured a strategic partnership. That's the idea behind those, is being able to not only offer grant certainty to those large associations, but also work with them to ensure that some of the more strategic policy objectives can be delivered in partnership with them too. So there are community-led mentioned in strategic partnership applications, and those strategic partners that were successful. And so we'll be working with them, and we'll also work with others where opportunities arise. In addition to that, we have our loan funding through the Home Building Fund, which supports SMEs to deliver housing on sites that are difficult or where they haven't been able to get lending elsewhere. And I think community-led organisations and contractors and partners that community-led organisations work with could access that funding and could make a real difference in delivery. We have seen schemes come forward where that's happened and has allowed that to go forward, and also a cocktail of different funds. So perhaps some Affordable Homes Programme funding, perhaps some HBF and others. But I agree that what's needed to enable that access is support for groups at an earlier stage. So revenue support for groups, but also we've got a network. There is now the network of hubs that has been set up to offer expert support and advice to get groups, amongst other things, to get groups ready to try and bid in for Homes England funding. And I think that's a really key part of the of bringing the sector and upping the sector's delivery from what is already a great level, but up to the sort of level that Danny Kruger MP was talking about earlier. So just to wrap up, as I know we're quite short of time, I really welcome the report. Really looking forward to continue to work with the community-led sector. I think we've got a good working relationship, and as an agency, we want to continue that and really sort of realise the potential of community-led development that we know is out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. That's very helpful, and we're likewise very grateful for Homes England's interest and support in the sector, and similarly with the Greater London Authority. So I'll pass over to Alexis Harris, who is Housing Policy Manager in the Housing and Land Directorate in the GLA.
Great, thank you, Tom. It's really good to join you all this morning, and it's been really interesting to listen to all the discussions and to read the report, which I think is great. So as Tom mentioned, my name is Alexis Harris. I'm Housing Policy Manager at the GLA, and I also sit on the Mayor's Community Housing Funding Panel, which is the panel responsible for making decisions about community-led housing schemes coming through London. So I've been asked to speak briefly, and I'll keep it really brief, about London's community housing offer, and I'll also provide a couple of observations on the report. So I'll start by emphasising that both the Mayor of London and our Deputy Mayor, Tom Copley, are both really committed to ensuring that local communities are placed at the heart of new development. So they've been really vocal about this commitment through the London Plan, through the London Housing Strategy, and more recently through kind of London's recovery programme, where we've been launching kind of a range of new funds and programmes that really do place communities at the kind of centre of placemaking and at the centre of building as London kind of emerges from the pandemic. As some of you I'm sure will know, the Mayor has provided significant investment to grow London's community-led housing sector. So since 2018, we've allocated over £20 million to help community-led housing projects through our Community-Led Housing Fund. And we also launched the London Community-Led Housing Hub in 2018. So the hub provides funding as well, so revenue funding largely for community groups to access skills and expertise they need to get projects off the ground. And the hub's helped over 91 community groups and 10 London boroughs, including through the allocation of over £1.8 million in grants. So I think the hub has been really critical to the success of the fund in London, and it's meant that we now have over 1,200 community-led homes currently in the pipeline including 200 confirmed projects and 66 homes underway. In terms of the types of homes that are coming through in London, we've engaged and heard from a variety of groups interested in pursuing projects, which I think has been really positive. These range from smaller groups of people who want to provide housing for themselves. And then we've heard also from larger scale projects led by community-led organisations who are kind of looking to provide affordable housing for their communities. Groups include organisations like community land trusts, housing cooperatives, co-housing, as well as sort of other charity and trust models. One thing that I think has been quite interesting in London is that we have a particularly constrained land market. So it's been really interesting and positive to see some of the community-led housing projects utilising other GLA funds and programmes that aim to unlock land, particularly small sites. So we have the Crystal Palace Community Land Trust that has been able to get land through the Mayor's Small Sites, Small Builders programme, and we've got a 50-home community-led development in Haringey on the St Anne's Hospital site that was enabled through the Mayor's Land Fund. So I think for me, I think it's been interesting to see these programmes kind of working together, particularly focused on unlocking land and small sites in London, which is a real challenge for development across the board in the city. So I guess to wrap up, I just wanted to say we really welcome the research of the network. Well done, Tom, Catherine, and others involved. It's a good piece of work. I enjoyed reading it, and we agree with the conclusions that the UK's community-led housing sector needs more resources and more investment to thrive, including through revenue funding. So while we can celebrate and point to a number of successes through our programme, which I've been pleased to kind of run through very quickly today, the reality is that this part of the sector is new and it requires a different approach that we take to kind of our other partners in London, many of whom might have more commercial experience or are building housing at scale. And I think through our experience over the last 3 years, we know that this is a different type of group and it has different aims and purposes and objectives. That's why we've also called on government to expand and extend the Community Housing Fund in London through the upcoming spending review. We know it's really critical that we can not only grow the sector through additional investment, but also give long-term certainty to the sector to know that that funding will be there into the future. And particularly so that other partner organisations such as boroughs and registered providers can also have that certainty to work with community groups in this area. So I'll leave it there, but thanks again for allowing me the opportunity to speak, and congratulations on the publication of the report.
Thanks, Alexis. That's very helpful and fantastic that the GLA has, or the sector and the GLA together have reached the Mayor's target or milestone of over 1,000 community-led homes in the city now. So we've got about 10 minutes left and 3 more contributors, so I'll appeal to each of you to keep your remarks to 3 minutes so we don't miss out John at the end to hear the bank's perspective. We're going to go over now to Steve Fife, who's Head of Housing Strategy at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority.
Many thanks, Tom. Thank you for inviting me in a really interesting session and a good report, Tom and Catherine. Some quick points from me then. Catherine did a good job of describing some of the stuff that we're up to in Greater Manchester with the Combined Authority in this space. We see community-led housing as one of the ways we can add different ways to delivering on our housing shortage, if you like, and it's been in our housing strategy since 2019. So we've been supporting the development of the GM hub financially and by getting involved in the steering group and so on. And we're able to do that because we have a devolved fund, a housing investment loan fund, 300 million as part of one of our devolution deals. And we can reuse the interest on that for purposes connected to the housing strategy, which is great. And I guess in terms of the recommendations in this report, not all CAs are created equal. So we have that fund, which is slightly different from the one in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, which is slightly different from others. And some CAs don't have a housing fund in the same way. So I think CAs have a potential role here in general, because of this kind of geographical scale that we work at, gives you a degree of economy of scale in I guess a niche part of the housing delivery operation, which district colleagues, local authority colleagues, given the constraints they've got on capacity, aren't always able to step into perhaps as actively as they'd like to, particularly around issues like land and so on. So it does feel like the CA collective have a role here, and I think we'd support the recommendations in the report on that basis. Listening to Alexis, we're slightly differently placed. We don't really have funds that we can use to grant to community-led housing groups specifically. We can use our investment fund to provide development finance, but we'd be looking for that to be repaid. So there are differences around the country, which community-led housing groups perhaps shouldn't need to understand the subtleties of. And I guess that kind of comes back to the underlying point from me around stability of funding. I think the title of the report is really instructive, a pipeline of schemes, a pipeline of opportunities, if you like. And we need to give that pipeline a chance to flow and stop-start funding and uncertainty about funding, whether that's revenue or capital, doesn't aid that. So we need that stability, because we know community-led housing isn't a quick win, but it's very often a win-win. It brings place shaping, it brings community cohesion, it brings low carbon, and so on. It brings innovation. So we need to invest in that, I think, and give that stable support that I think this report describes very well. So very quickly, that's a view from GM.
Steve, thank you. That's really helpful, and it's been great to see the sector going from strength to strength with your support in recent years in Greater Manchester. Now I'm going to hand over to Holger Westphally, who's the acting head of CAF Venturesome, which have been a long-standing investor in community-led housing. Holger.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I just want to quickly introduce what we do and reinforce some of the messages of the report, which we agree wholeheartedly with. And as you saw, we contributed from my experience. So in the 13 years that we've been supporting the community-led housing sector, we have found that the pipeline is very much reactive to the funding, as you'd expect, and so we've tried to keep our funding stable and available and so on, but we have experienced that government funding will have a big impact in what we see coming through to us. So first of all, I echo Steve's point on that stability. On the other hand, it's great to see that we're now talking about 650 plus active projects, when 13 years ago there were less than 100, and it does show that when the funding is available, the schemes, the projects have the confidence to go ahead and do the heavy lifting, which is the work of planning and consulting stakeholders and pulling together their budgets and their business plans and securing the funding. So we are funded by philanthropic funders who want to play a part in supporting this, but they very much take their lead from what government is doing. So if we have a longer period of very little deal flow, our funding will also disappear. So it's not as if we could stay around and provide that ad infinitum. We very much need the sector to thrive in order to continue to be able to attract this philanthropic funding into the sector. So again, I want to wholeheartedly offer my support to the conclusion of this report, which is very timely and welcome. That extension of the CHF is a huge part of a continued sector that is thriving and growing and delivering homes. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you all.
Thanks, Holger. That's very helpful. And finally, we're going to hear from John Lee, who is Business Development Manager at Ecology Building Society, both a long-standing investor in community-led housing and also a supporter of the Community Land Trust Network. John, over to you to finish us off.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks everybody. Hello. Just to keep this fairly brief. Firstly, yeah, obviously welcome the report, and I think from the point of view of somebody who works increasingly regularly with groups in the sector, it reflects what we know, and that's that it's a successful and vibrant sector that's making a big impact in terms of not only addressing affordable housing in parts of the country that really need it, but also designing some very sustainable communities as well. Net zero carbon being a big part of our agenda going forward, and addressing climate risk and so on. And I don't find community groups that approach us require educating, particularly in those areas, because they are wanting to create communities that deliver very sustainable solutions, which is great to see. Over the last couple of years, we've actually invested and brought more capital into the society to meet the increasing demands of investing in community-led housing projects, and that is bearing fruit for us. I think it's fair to say that, as Holger was saying, that we saw quite an uptick in interest in new groups coming through on the back of the Community Housing Fund, as was. And I think there is certainly a role to play for supported funding into the sector going ahead, particularly for projects that we're often dealing with groups that don't have track record and asset bases to secure new project funding against, and at the end of the day, it's got to be about affordability for groups as well. I think what the Community Housing Fund does at its best is it leverages a significant amount of additional capital from places like Ecology Building Society and Cath Venture and others to be able to make these schemes viable for the long term and build that sector strength, so that these organisations, as they grow and develop, will have the ability to be much more self-sufficient. We've certainly seen as we lend UK-wide, that there is a continued uptick in projects in Scotland and in London, where there are existing government funds available to help reduce the amount of commercial debt that groups need to find. And that, I think, is quite a persuasive argument. Is this a flash in the pan? I don't think so. I think we're seeing the numbers of groups coming through to us increasing rapidly over the last few months, even during the pandemic. And maybe there's a link there in a sort of world where we're coming out of the pandemic, where people are reappraising how they want to live, where they want to live, having more of a community feel to their living arrangements. And there's probably also a case for looking closely at how we regenerate our town centres and so on in more urban settings as well, on the back of some of the changes that we might be seeing as a result of different ways of working and different changes in the retail sector as well. But yeah, just in conclusion, I think we really welcome the report. I think it's right and proper that it calls for greater collaboration between funders like ourselves, and we're really keen to try and encourage not just government to back this, but to get other mortgage lenders, other development finance lenders into the sector. It can be quite a tricky sector to explain to people who aren't familiar with it, and I think this report confirms what we already knew, that it has real future and a very good infrastructure now in place to be able to support groups, to bring them through to the likes of ourselves and enable us to really get to grips with their projects. So thanks for the opportunity to say a few words to Tom and Catherine for all your hard work, and I hope that's been a useful perspective.
Thank you, John. Well, that wraps up the roundtable respondents. We have had lots of interesting questions in the Q&A, but sadly we've just got past 11 o'clock. So our priorities with this research are, first of all, the spending review, and to try to seek that longer term revenue funding that everybody has agreed is needed and that could significantly unlock investment from John, Holger, Steve, Alexis, Matthew and others. But also to over the coming months, look at how we take forward these other recommendations and conclusions around things such as more replicable delivery routes, other ways of bringing in finance, and so on. So we will definitely come to your questions in another form another day. I would like to thank again the Nationwide Foundation and Power to Change for funding the research, Tom and Catherine for writing what I think is an excellent and well-received piece of work, and to Danny, Christopher, Matthew, Alexis, Steve, Holger and John for all of your very considered responses. We will close it there and no doubt see you all soon in another guise. Thanks very much.